It's the 22nd of November today, and for the first time I can ever remember, I haven't heard any mention from anyone of the fact that it's the 58th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And that's pretty weird, because the whole time I was growing up, well into my adulthood, November 22nd was one of those dates, much like December 7th and later September 11th, that are inextricably linked with a certain historical event. When I was a kid, each time November 22nd rolled around, unless there was some other major breaking news story, the JFK anniversary was always the main topic of discussion that day. It started to quiet down a little bit in the latter half of the 80s, but when 1991 rolled around and Oliver Stone put out that stupid movie, that put the assassination right back into the forefront of the public consciousness, and it also had the regrettable effect of causing nonsense conspiracy theories to be believed by untold millions of people, either because they were too young to remember the actual facts of the case, or they were too gullible and credulous to tell intellectual crack cocaine when they see it. So the 90s wound up being sort of a golden age of renewed interest in the assassination, and at first it was mostly on the conspiracy side, but as the decade went on, there started being a pushback from those on the more rational side of things. People like Gerald Posner and Vincent Bugliosi, among others, who wrote books that were devoted largely to debunking and discrediting some of the more fanciful conspiracy theories that were in popular currency at that time. And that is exactly how such things should work in a liberal capitalist democracy where the right of free speech is guaranteed. Since it is a free country, you can write any stupid book you want, fill it up with whatever silly half-baked fantasies you like, and if you can convince enough dummies to buy it in order to create a nice payday for yourself, then more power to you. But since free speech is both a double-edged sword and a two-way street, if you manage to make yourself rich and popular by trafficking in conspiratorial nonsense, that will create a backlash. And books will be written in response to your book. Books that point out the flaws in your thesis, which point out the facts that you have either invented or omitted in order to arrive at your favored conclusion. And who knows, maybe that book becomes just as popular as your book. And everybody wins as far as the authors go, and the reading public is left to draw its own inferences in a free and open marketplace of ideas about what the truth actually is. The other thing that happened around 1990 was that a British documentary came out called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And that film was responsible almost as much as Oliver Stone's JFK for implanting in the public mind some of the sillier conspiracy canards that went on to enjoy rather great popularity in the mid to late 90s. But most importantly, while Oliver Stone had done more of a polite tap dance around the periphery of the issue regarding Lyndon Johnson's possible complicity in the assassination, wherein he sort of pointed out that Johnson stood to be the primary beneficiary of Kennedy's death, but there were no accusations leveled directly. But in the last episode of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, those producers, they came right out and said it, that Lyndon Johnson had not only gained a benefit from the events of 22 November 1963 in Dallas, but that he had personally conceived and planned and spearheaded the entire operation. And for evidence, they pointed to the personal antipathy that existed between Kennedy and Johnson, who, of course, had intensely disliked each other from the very first day they met, who couldn't stand to be in one another's presence during the time when they were both in the Senate. They, of course, had been bitter rivals for the Democrat nomination in 1960. They represented different wings of the party. They had profoundly different views on some of the key issues of the day. And on a personal level, Kennedy viewed Johnson as a sort of vulgar, corrupt, old boy Texas machine politician, and Johnson viewed Kennedy as a soft, effete Ivy League playboy who was too busy chasing every skirt in Washington to pay much attention to the business of being a legislator. So when Kennedy secured the 1960 nomination at the convention in Los Angeles, there were no observers anywhere who expected him to offer the number 2 spot on the ticket to Johnson, of all people, or for Johnson to accept it if it were offered. But Kennedy decided that if they wanted to win this election, then they needed to unite the wings of the party and enter into a marriage of convenience, which they ultimately did. And they went on, of course, to win the election. Allegedly. So when Kennedy suddenly gets killed 3 years later, Johnson has a hell of a lot of important decisions to make and not much time in which to make them. The assassination happens on Friday the 22nd. The funeral is on Monday the 25th, and the new president plans to address the nation on the evening of Wednesday the 27th. At first, he plans on doing an Oval Office address, but he has a talk with Eisenhower. Eisenhower convinces him that the gravity of the moment demands that he should call a joint session of Congress and do the speech there. And his other conundrum involves how exactly he's going to portray himself. Should he make a clean break and come out and say that I'm going to be my own man and my own president? Or does he go the route of saying, I am going to be the guardian of the John Kennedy legacy. I'm going to continue his policies and his initiatives and try to do right by his memory. Now, his instinct, as you might imagine, was to go the former route, but he talked with lots of people during those 2 or 3 days when the contents of the speech were being formulated. And almost to the last man, even the people on his own staff, said it would be a much smarter play to do the latter thing, and so he did the latter thing. He gave a speech that not only paid tribute to Kennedy, but practically turned him into a martyr and a demigod. It can't have made Johnson happy having to do such a thing, but remember, that trip to Texas was supposed to be the unofficial kickoff of the '64 campaign, so as the new President Johnson is addressing the Congress on 27 November, there is an election in less than a year, and even though he is now the incumbent president, there is no guarantee that he's going to be the party's nominee, and it won't help his chances if he says anything that can be perceived as a slight to Kennedy's memory. Fast forward all the way to today. And there are a lot of similarities to be seen, I think, in terms of a president and a vice president who are not each other's biggest fan, to put it mildly, who said rather nasty things about one another during the campaign, who entered into a political marriage of convenience, and whose respective staffs exist in a seemingly perpetual state of enmity and dysfunction. And just like in November of '63, even though nobody has died in this case, the Democrats have no idea who their nominee is going to be in the next presidential election. Since the current president is both unpopular and barely sentient, and the vice president is even more intensely unpopular than he is. And I continue to marvel at how one party can control the entire playing field, wield every lever of power, co-opt every institution, be serviced constantly by a dutiful, compliant, water-carrying news media, and still be floundering as badly as they are. But I do have some thoughts on why that is, which we will get into in the main segment. Now, Jim Eagle, if you would hit that music like it's a disobedient stepchild. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where our idea of criminal justice reform is allowing looters to choose whether they wish to be executed by axe or by broadsword. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and I want to walk you through a hypothetical. Can I walk you through a hypothetical? All right, let's suppose, just as a thought experiment, let's say BLM was having a march, a peaceful protest, if you will. That is to say, an actual peaceful protest, as opposed to the fiery orgies of violence and bloodlust and human depravity that they normally like to describe as peaceful protests. Let's say they're just marching from one place to another, waving their little signs, chanting their little slogans, having a good time, minding their own business, exercising their God-given right to petition the state for redress of their grievances. Now, imagine a MAGA hat-wearing white guy drives a goddamn SUV at a high rate of speed straight into those marchers, kills at least 5 of them, wounds over 2 dozen, leaves behind the crumpled bodies of many children and grandmothers. Suppose the identity of the perpetrator becomes public knowledge. And suppose this guy is a full-on, ultra-right-wing QAnon insurrectionist lunatic, the kind of guy who stopped listening to Alex Jones because he was too liberal, the kind of guy who has Gadsden flag underwear and a tattoo of the text of the Second Amendment. His social media history overflows with statements of unbridled, crazy, right-wing nuttery. Now, do you think the news media would spend the next 24 hours after the incident stridently refusing to discuss that man's personal characteristics and attributes? Do you think they would make a concerted effort to never once mention his racial heritage, do you think they would refrain from calling the quintuple murder an act of domestic terrorism, or go out of their way to insist that there's no evidence this was a hate crime? Best of all, do you think they would go so far as to invent out of whole cloth, out of their own fevered imaginations, a cover story for the alleged quintuple murderer? So leaving behind the hypothetical, for I trust the point has been made adequately, the news media's spiral down the toilet bowl of sleaziness and corruption and serial dishonesty continues apace. I don't think they would so quickly outdo themselves from last week, but they have, with the jury intimidation and all that stuff, but they have proved me wrong, and I'll be damned. You surely have heard by now the terrible news from last night in Waukesha, Wisconsin, or Waukesha. I don't know which pronunciation is correct, and there seems to be no consensus nationally, so I give up. Where a guy plowed an SUV into a Christmas parade, killed and maimed and hurt a whole bunch of innocent, blameless people in an attack that could not have been anything but a purposeful attempt by the assailant to cause mass casualties and inflict maximal suffering upon his victims. But leave it to good old CNN. They gave it the college try and attempted to smear some lipstick on that pig, because apparently making excuses for some of the most terrible people and some of the most monstrous acts in the whole wide world is what CNN prides itself on these days. They invented the story, and again, by all indications, CNN just made this up based on nothing. That the perpetrator of this terrorist mass murder wasn't really a terrorist mass murderer, because he was actually fleeing from a different crime that he had just committed, stabbing a dude, I think it was. So when he plowed into that crowd of children and grandmothers at 30-odd miles an hour and actually aimed his car so he would hit more people, it was not a terrorist mass murder, says CNN. He was just running from the cops because he stabbed a guy. So please, will you stop impugning this man's good name and character by calling him a terrorist? And that's where CNN went with it. So you stay classy, CNN. You're the shining city on the hill of good journalism. So this scumbag they have in custody for this crime is a 39-year-old black nationalist whose name I shall not dignify by mentioning it. If his social media history is any indication, he has fully drunk the Kool-Aid of the prevailing narrative that says America is bad and evil, white people are bad and evil, segregation is good, racism is virtuous as long as you call it anti-racism. He's got a rap sheet as long as your arm and my arm put together. This dude's been arrested for crimes I didn't even know existed. To call this guy a career criminal is almost to understate the breadth and the scope of his body of work. If you were going to make a list of people who ought to be in prison permanently, this guy's name would be on it, first page, above the fold. But he wasn't in prison yesterday. Instead, he was murdering women and children with a large motor vehicle. His ability to have done so, that's for the local authorities to answer for, because they turned him loose on $1,000 bail 2 days ago when he was charged with multiple violent felonies. And his motivation for doing this, if the appearances wind up being correct, and this was in fact a racist terror attack, well, we can lay that at the feet of people like CNN and every other sleazy, verminous fake news sludge factory that's spent the last 5-6 years now gleefully trying to promote and incite racial violence, to sow racial discord, and to divide the people of the country along racial lines. They aren't the ones who have to deal with the human suffering that is always the end result when hatred is preached. It's the dancing grandmas and the middle school cheerleaders and their survivors who have to wind up paying that butcher's bill. It's the people who outlived them, who are left to bury their bodies. They're the ones who get left to pick up the pieces, while Joy Reid and Brian Stelter and Fredo Cuomo and Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow collect their 8-figure salaries and go home to their tastefully furnished Upper East Side penthouses. But isn't it about time we start holding people to account for the awful, hateful, wicked things they promote and for the real-world consequences of the things they say? And it all starts with the original sin of single-factor analysis, that first fatal intellectual shortcut where you try to take a complex, complicated world and boil it down to something simple so you can make yourself feel morally righteous. So you notice a fact about the world. Say, you notice the fact that black Americans make up a disproportionate percentage of the prison prison population compared to their share of the general population. And rather than doing the work, rather than trying to understand and appreciate all of the factors that go into making that reality, you want something simple. You want a morality tale that you can fit on a bumper sticker. So you take that disparity in the prison population, you pluck it out in isolation, you throw out every other bit of demographic data, every confounding factor, you throw them all right out the window, and you proclaim systemic racism. Ladies and gentlemen, a racial disparity in the prison population can only mean that our entire system is a racist system. It was racist in its founding, racist in its conception, and an institution founded and conceived in racism cannot be reformed. It has to be torn out, root and stem. The whole rotten, stinking edifice must be torn down, or else true justice can never be achieved. And once you have bought into that sort of lazy nonsense thinking, it's not a very long drive to get from there to the dancing grandmas getting run over en masse by a radicalized black nationalist in a big SUV. Why? Because once you have opened the door to the belief, an irrational, unfounded belief, that the country's justice system is intrinsically biased against people of a certain color, then that belief stipulates, if you want to be anti-racism, as a good woke district attorney or police chief, if you want to bring racial equity to the professional vineyard in which you toil, then you have to work to dismantle that system, and you have to start that work close to home. So if you see a racial disparity in the population of your local county jail, you have to fix that disparity. There can't be equity and justice until the jail population is demographically indistinguishable from the general population. And will you look at that? Our jail population is 30% black, but our county is only 15% black. So obviously, we are doing something racist, and we have to be stopped. So deputy, I want you to go in there and release black prisoners until we hit 15%. You got that? And the deputy says, which black prisoners do you want me to release, sir? And the sheriff says, well, duh, the 50% of the 30% who are here on trumped-up racist charges. Obviously, do I have to explain everything to you? And the deputy says, sorry, sir, I just don't think I know how to tell the difference between a real black criminal and an innocent victim of systemic racism. And the sheriff says, you worry too much, kid. And besides, with you asking all these questions, I'm starting to doubt your commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's almost like you enjoy seeing all these black men locked up. And the deputy says, it's not like that at all, sir. I'm just afraid we might release someone who's a danger to the community, and I don't want to see innocent people get hurt. And the sheriff says, grow up, son. You can't make a progress omelet without breaking a few dancing grandmas. Now, guys like this wind up on the street with carte blanche, effectively, to harm and kill the innocent because our country is overrun with crazy, dumbass people in positions of power, including in law enforcement, where the delusion of this single-factor worldview has them turning violent, dangerous criminals loose on the streets because they honestly, stupidly believe they are doing a morally upstanding thing by attempting to redress a systemic racial disparity, when in reality they are abdicating the duties of their office and getting innocent civilians killed for no damn good reason. Wokesterism is not just a funny thing to mock and laugh at, though it most assuredly is that. It is also a clear and present danger to law and order and to civil society itself. I am not, generally speaking, a big fan of political purges, but our country would do well to purge a couple different public sectors first, and most importantly, law enforcement. Second, only slightly less importantly, public education. We don't need people in law enforcement who think their job is promoting social justice. We need people in law enforcement who are going to enforce the law. And we don't need teachers who think their job is implanting their political worldview into the minds of other people's children. That is not teaching. We need teachers who are content to teach. And when we're done with those two, I guess we can move on to the military. Suffice it to say, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. And we will leave it there for tonight. I will see you Wednesday. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Continue not complying. Get the hell off my lawn.